August 1945, Okinawa. The air is thick, a suffocating blanket of humidity and the iron-sweet scent of wet earth. Rain, sudden and violent as it only falls in the subtropics, lashes against the jagged limestone ridges of the south. In the distance, the low, rhythmic thrum of American diesel engines vibrates through the mud, a mechanical heartbeat that seems to consume the very silence of the island. Within the jagged maw of a natural cave, hidden deep beneath the roots of ancient banyan trees, the darkness is absolute, broken only by the flickering, guttering light of a single kerosene lamp. The walls of the cavern are slick with condensation, weeping like the broken spirits of those huddled within. Here, the atmosphere is heavy with the smell of antiseptic, gangrene, and a desperate, pervasive fear. For the Japanese nurses of the Hibaru hospital units, time has lost all linear meaning. They exist in a subterranean purgatory, waiting for the inevitable end. The sound of footsteps outside, the heavy rhythmic crunch of combat boots on gravel, signals the arrival of a world they were told would only bring their destruction. Sunlight begins to bleed into the tunnel entrance, a harsh, blinding white that forces the women to shield their eyes. It is the light of a new and terrifying era. They clutch their meager belongings, their white uniforms stained with the grime of months in the earth, expecting the bayonet or the flame. Instead, they find themselves staring into the blue-tinted shadows of the Americans, whose silhouettes loom large against the Okinawan sky. The heat of the day pours into the cave, a physical weight that carries with it the smell of exhaust and sea salt. It is a moment frozen between the death of one empire and the uncertain birth of another. In this narrow aperture of history, the silence is so profound that the dripping of water from a stalactite sounds like a hammer strike. Every breath is shallow, every muscle taut, as the nurses prepare for the end they were promised. The American soldiers do not rush in with screams. They stand at the threshold, their forms illuminated by a sun that feels alien to those who have lived in the dark. It is the beginning of an encounter that will shatter every certainty held by the daughters of the rising sun. To understand this moment, one must look back at the harrowing months that preceded the silence of the caves. By the summer of 1945, the empire of the rising sun was no longer a sprawling conqueror, but a wounded beast retreating into the shadows of its own jagged archipelago. The Battle of Okinawa, the final bloody gate to the Japanese mainland, had become a meat grinder of unprecedented scale. For 82 days, the island was subjected to a typhoon of steel, a relentless bombardment from sea and air that reshaped the very topography of the land. In this desperate theater, the Japanese High Command had pivoted from traditional military strategy to a doctrine of total spiritual mobilization. The civilian population, including the young women of the Student Nurse Corps, were integrated into a death cult of national proportions. They were told that to surrender was to invite a fate worse than death, that the American forces were not men, but oni, demons who would find sport in their agony. This indoctrination was not merely rhetorical, it was the foundation of their survival. Every schoolgirl-turned-nurse carried with her a small ceramic grenade or a vial of potassium cyanide, intended for the moment the Americans breached the line. The historical significance of this transition cannot be overstated. Okinawa was the first time the American military encountered a massive, organized body of Japanese female non-combatants in such a concentrated, desperate setting. The ideological collision was set. On one side, a culture prepared for the glorious, shattered jewel of collective suicide. On the other, an industrial giant moving with the slow, inevitable momentum of a logistical machine. This was the context of the caves. The medical units were not merely hospitals. They were symbols of a fading order, where bandages were made of shredded clothing and anesthesia was a memory. The war had ceased to be about territory and had become a struggle for the very definition of humanity. As the American front line pushed southward, thousands of these young women found themselves trapped between the rigid demands of imperial honor and the terrifying unknown of the approaching Westerners. The world above was being erased by fire, while the world below held its breath, convinced that the rising sun had finally set, leaving only a darkness filled with monsters. This was the precipice upon which they stood, a moment where history held its breath, waiting to see if the brutality of the past 3 years would find its logical conclusion in a final, bloody massacre, or if something entirely unexpected would emerge from the smoke of the battlefield. The light from the cave entrance was not the flash of an explosion, but a steady, penetrating glow that revealed the grim reality of the subterranean ward. As the American infantrymen stepped aside to allow the Navy medical officers through, the Japanese nurses braced for the impact of steel. They had been taught that the Americans were savage beasts who delighted in the torment of the defeated. Some of the younger women squeezed their eyes shut, fingers trembling over the hidden grenades in their pockets, waiting for the first scream. But the scream never came. Instead, the cavern was filled with a low, calm murmur. The Americans did not charge. They moved with a strange, almost casual deliberateness. A Navy doctor, his sleeves rolled up to reveal skin tanned by the Pacific sun, knelt in the filth beside a wounded soldier without drawing his sidearm. The nurses watched, paralyzed by a profound cognitive dissonance. The demons were checking pulses with gentle fingers and speaking in tones that, while unintelligible, carried the unmistakable cadence of care rather than conquest. This was the first rupture in the wall of imperial propaganda. The expected brutality was replaced by a clinical, almost indifferent efficiency that was more shocking than violence would have been. One by one, the nurses began to lower their hands. The Americans looked at them not as trophies of war, but as exhausted human beings in need of processing. There was no mockery in their eyes, only the weary professionalism of men who had seen too much death to find joy in more. The physical space of the cave, once a tomb of nationalistic fervor, suddenly became a theater of radical humanity. As the nurses were ushered toward the surface, they walked past rows of American soldiers leaning against their jeeps, smoking and chatting, seemingly oblivious to the divine importance of the struggle that had just ended. The contrast was jarring. To the Japanese, every moment was a step toward a tragic crescendo. To the Americans, this was simply the work of a Tuesday afternoon. This initial encounter was the first time the nurses realized that the enemy they had been prepared to die fighting did not exist. In his place stood a tall, well-fed stranger who offered a hand to help them over the rubble, an act of simple grace that felt like a betrayal of everything they had been told about the world. They emerged into the daylight not as martyrs, but as survivors, blinking at a sun that no longer demanded their blood. The nurses stood in the blinding Okinawan sun, their eyes struggling to adjust after the perpetual twilight of the caves. As they looked upon their captors, the emotional contrast was staggering. These women were the living embodiment of the imperial sacrifice, hollow-cheeked, skeletal figures whose ribs pressed sharply against skin turned sallow from malnutrition and lack of light. Their hair was matted with the dust of pulverized coral, and their hands, though steady in their duty, were stained with the deep, indelible grime of a failed resistance. They looked at the Americans and saw a different species entirely. The GIs stood tall, their shoulders broad and their faces flushed with the vitality of a nation that had never known the gnawing emptiness of a true blockade. While the Japanese had survived on a handful of molded rice or bitter cycad nuts, these men seemed to vibrate with a surplus of energy. The nurses observed the Americans' gear, sturdy leather boots without a single hole, uniforms of thick, high-quality cotton, and belts heavy with equipment. To the Japanese mind, conditioned by the spiritual power of the Yamato soul to overcome material deficiency, the sheer physical presence of the Americans was a silent, crushing defeat. They had been told that luxury made men weak and that the Americans were soft, decadent cowards who would crumble before the superior will of the emperor's subjects. Yet, standing there in the heat, they saw no weakness. They saw the terrifying strength of a civilization that could move mountains of steel across an ocean and still have enough strength to smile. The nurses felt a surge of shame, then a deeper, more unsettling confusion. How could a people so decadent possess such overwhelming vitality? The American soldiers moved with a relaxed confidence that suggested they were not merely winning a war, but were already living in the peace that followed. The Japanese had expected to meet a desperate, bloodthirsty enemy. Instead, they met a force that seemed almost bored by its own dominance. This visual and emotional chasm, between the starving asceticism of the cave and the exuberant abundance of the victors, marked the moment the nurses began to realize they had been lied to. It was not just their army that had been defeated, but their entire understanding of what made a nation strong. The silence of the nurses was not just a product of fear, but of a profound, shattering awe. In the faces of the young men from Ohio and California, they saw a standard of living that felt like a fantasy, a reality where survival was not a daily miracle but a basic, unquestioned assumption. As the nurses were guided toward a makeshift processing center near the shoreline, their eyes were drawn to a sight that defied the logic of the battlefield. Resting atop a folding field table, catching the mid-morning rays of the sun, was a collection of metallic vessels. To the weary women, these objects did not look like standard military issue. They possessed a luster that seemed almost miraculous amidst the charred ruins of the island. This was the first appearance of the silver tea service, a gleaming array of stainless steel pitchers, polished aluminum canisters, and heavy-duty thermal urns. In the Japanese tradition, tea was a ceremony of precision, often performed with ceramic or bamboo in quiet, austere settings. But here, the American version was industrial, bold, and brilliantly reflective. The silver sheen of the metal represented more than just utility. It was a testament to a nation that had so much raw material that even its field kitchens shone like jewelry. The nurses stared at the steam rising from the spouts, a swirling mist that carried a scent they had forgotten existed in the stench of the caves. To a soldier of the empire, metal was a precious, finite resource, stripped from temple bells and household pots to be forged into bayonets and casing shells. Yet, the Americans used it for the most mundane of comforts. The containers were dented from travel but remained unyielding, symbols of a logistics chain that stretched across 10,000 miles of ocean without losing its polish. This metal did not represent the sharp, cold edge of a sword, but the warm, protective vessel of a provider. The nurses watched as a young orderly wiped the condensation from a pitcher with a clean white cloth, a luxury of fabric that was itself a shock. The silver tea service stood as a silent sentinel of democracy's industrial might, a recurring reminder that the Americans were not fighting a war of scarcity, but a war of overwhelming, shimmering surplus. For the Japanese women, the sight of such brilliant, clean equipment was a psychological blow as heavy as any artillery shell. It suggested a world where the basic needs of life were treated with a dignity and a permanence that their own crumbling military could no longer provide. The steel was cold to the touch, but it promised something the nurses had longed for in the damp heat of the bunkers, a sense of order, a sense of cleanliness, and the terrifying realization that the devils possessed a beauty in their strength that the propaganda had never dared to mention. They looked at the reflection of their own haggard faces in the side of a polished urn and saw, for the first time, the possibility that the world outside the cave was not just alive, but thriving with a brilliance they could scarcely comprehend. The evidence of this logistical miracle was not merely anecdotal. It was woven into the very fabric of the invasion's data. By this stage of the campaign, the American military had transformed the Ryukyu Islands into the largest supply base in the western Pacific, funneling millions of tons of material through the shattered ports. Historical records of the era reveal a disparity that bordered on the surreal. While the Japanese 32nd Army had been reduced to foraging for grass and bark, the American logistics machine was capable of delivering 7 times the caloric intake, supported by a fleet of over 1,400 ships. This was not just a military occupation. It was a demonstration of a gross domestic product mobilized for total victory. The nurses, as they moved through the American encampment, saw the physical manifestation of these numbers. They saw mountains of wooden crates stamped with U.S. government property, stacked 20 feet high and stretching toward the horizon. They saw specialized refrigeration units humming in the tropical heat, an impossibility for a Japanese military that struggled to find clean water. This was the victory through logistics doctrine in its most raw form. It was a war won by the factory worker in Detroit and the farmer in Iowa as much as the soldier on the ridge. The nurses noticed that the American doctors didn't just have medicine, they had an endless supply of it, packaged in sterile, uniform glass vials that spoke of a precision and a wealth that the empire had never achieved even in its years of greatest triumph. The sheer weight of this evidence crushed the lingering hope of imperial resistance. It became clear that they were not just fighting men, but a global industrial engine that viewed the supply of luxury goods to the front lines as a standard operational requirement. The sheer volume of equipment, the trucks, the bulldozers, the prefabricated hospitals, provided a factual foundation for the nurses' growing realization that their cause had been lost long before the first shot was fired on Okinawa. It was the victory of the assembly line over the bayonet, and the evidence was everywhere they looked. The moment of transformation occurred not with a lecture on political theory, but with a simple gesture of hospitality. Under the shade of a canvas tent, an American sergeant gestured toward the gleaming silver tea service. He did not demand a bow or a display of submission. He simply tilted the polished vessel, and a stream of dark, fragrant liquid cascaded into a clean porcelain cup. Then, with a casualness that bordered on the irreverent, he reached into a large sack and scooped out a generous portion of white, refined sugar, stirring it in until the crystals vanished. He held the cup out to the head nurse. A collective gasp rippled through the Japanese women, a sharp, audible intake of breath that echoed the shattering of 1,000 lies. To the nurses, this was an impossibility. In the dying days of the empire, sugar was a ghost, a luxury reserved for the highest echelons of the imperial household or the final, bitter toast of a kamikaze pilot. Tea was a rationed memory. Yet here, in the middle of a wasteland of coral and ash, the demons were offering it for free, to their enemies, with a surplus of sweetness that felt like a divine excess. The steam rising from the cup carried the scent of a civilization that did not just survive, but thrived. As the head nurse took the cup, her fingers trembling against the warmth of the vessel, she realized that the Americans were not merely victors of a battle. They were the masters of a reality that made her own struggle seem tragically unnecessary. The free tea was a gift of such profound material and moral weight that it rendered the previous years of sacrifice hollow. It was the ultimate weapon of the American arsenal, not the bullet that kills the body, but the kindness that kills the ideology of hate. The nurses stood in a state of suspended disbelief, staring at the dark liquid as if it were liquid gold. In that single, sweet sip, the world of the cave, the world of starvation, suicide grenades, and darkness, dissolved. They had been prepared to die for a nation that could not feed them, only to be saved by a nation that gave them sugar and tea simply because it had more than enough to share. The gasp was the sound of a people waking up from a long, terrible nightmare into a morning of terrifying, beautiful abundance. This sweetness was the catalyst for a total internal collapse of the imperial identity. As the nurses tasted the tea, the psychological architecture of the Showa era, built on the pillars of endurance, self-denial, and the aestheticization of suffering, began to crumble. For years, they had been told that the Yamato spirit was a force of nature that could overcome any material disadvantage, provided one was willing to die for the emperor. They had been convinced that their starvation was a noble sacrifice, a spiritual tempering that made them superior to the decadent West. But as the warm liquid settled in their stomachs, the nobility of that hunger vanished. It was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Their suffering had not been a necessity of war, but a failure of their own leadership. The Americans did not need a spiritual doctrine to sustain them. They had a system that functioned with such staggering efficiency that they could afford to be merciful. The transformation was visible in the way the nurses began to carry themselves. The rigid, fearful tension in their shoulders relaxed, not because the danger had passed, but because the enemy had been humanized. They looked at the American soldiers and no longer saw the Oni of the propaganda posters. They saw young men who were part of a world where life was valued, where a nurse was expected to heal rather than to detonate a grenade in a final act of futility. This shift in perception was a silent revolution. It was the moment the nurses realized that the honor they had been promised was a cage, and the defeat they had feared was actually a liberation. The ideological grip of the military government was broken by the simple, undeniable fact of a full cup and a generous heart. They began to speak to one another in hushed tones, their eyes no longer fixed on the ground in shame, but looking upward with a burgeoning curiosity. They were witnessing the birth of a new Japan, one that would eventually rise from the ashes of the old not through the sword, but through the same spirit of industriousness and openness they saw in their captors. The tea had washed away the bitter taste of the propaganda, leaving behind a blank slate upon which a different future could be written, a future where the dignity of the individual was not a secondary concern to the glory of the state, but the very reason for the state's existence. The recurring image of the silver tea service, gleaming under the harsh Pacific sun, stood as a testament to more than just military victory. It was a physical manifestation of the democratic ideal. Throughout the campaign, the Japanese had been told that strength was found in the sharpening of the blade and the hardening of the heart against all comfort. Yet, here was a strength that did not require the abandonment of the human spirit. The polished steel of the tea urns reflected a world where the individual was not a mere cog in a war machine, but a soul worthy of warmth and dignity. This symbolism deepened with every cup poured. The metal did not signify the cold utility of the bullet, but the enduring permanence of a society that could produce both the tools of war and the vessels of peace with equal brilliance. To the nurses, the tea service became a mirror. In its reflection, they saw the absurdity of their previous existence, the starvation in the name of a distant divinity, the desperation in the service of a failing myth. The American abundance, symbolized by that shimmering metal, was not a sign of decadence, as the propaganda had claimed, but a sign of a system that functioned for the benefit of its people. It represented the arsenal of democracy in its most intimate form, the ability to provide a moment of grace to a defeated enemy. This was the true power that had crossed the ocean. It was not just the aircraft carriers or the atomic fire, but the capacity to maintain a standard of humanity even in the shadow of total war. The silver service remained bright even as the dust of Okinawa settled, a recurring light that reminded the survivors that the world they were entering was one of light and surplus. For the Japanese women, the metal was no longer something to be feared as a weapon, but something to be respected as a shield against the darkness of scarcity and the lies of the past. The tea, served from these gleaming monuments of industry, acted as a silent promise that the future would be built on the foundation of what a nation could provide, rather than what it could take away. The silver reflected a new truth, that the ultimate victory lay in the ability to offer a cup of tea to a stranger, and in doing so, to reclaim the humanity that the war had nearly extinguished. As the shadows of the Great Pacific War lengthen into the annals of history, the story of the Okinawan caves remains a singular testament to the power of human connection over the machinery of death. The war was ultimately won not just by the weight of bombs or the precision of rifles, but by the weight of a civilization that could afford to be kind. The nurses who walked out of the darkness and into the light of the American encampment were the first of millions to discover a profound truth, that the ultimate strength of a nation is found in its capacity for abundance, and its ultimate victory is found in the willingness to share that abundance with the world. The silver tea service, once a shocking symbol of an enemy's wealth, became the vessel of a lasting peace. It proved that the ideology of fear is no match for the reality of a warm meal, a sweet cup, and the recognition of a common humanity. In the end, the gasp heard in that tropical sun was the sound of a spirit being liberated from the chains of a desperate and hollow myth. It was the realization that freedom is not merely a political abstract, but a tangible, nourishing force that manifests in the simple dignity of a life well lived. The tea was free, the sugar was plentiful, and the future was wide open. From the ruins of the Ryukyu ridges emerged a new understanding, that true power does not lie in how many one can destroy, but in how many one can sustain. The legacy of that afternoon remains a quiet, poetic reflection on the nature of liberty, a truth that shines as brightly as polished steel, reminding us that even in the aftermath of the greatest storm, the light of human grace is the only thing that truly endures. The sun set on the empire, but it rose on a world where a cup of tea could change the course of a heart, and a heart could change the course of history.